There are few parts of the Western Front that bear the scars of war as vividly as this corner of northeast France. This shattered church is all that remains of the village of Orne, a few miles from the ancient fortress city of Verdun. In 1916, it was razored from the map, with 8 other villages, as a result of one man's monstrous vision. Erich von Falkenhayn, the German Chief of Staff, had decided that Verdun would be the place where France would bleed to death. By the beginning of 1916, the Western Front ran 400 miles across France, from the Belgian coast to the Swiss border. For more than a year, the opposing armies had been unable to break the deadlock of trench warfare. At Verdun, the German line looped around the city and its defensive forts. Verdun had been a bastion against the threat of German invasion for centuries. It sat astride the river Meuse, surrounded by hills. The Germans had gone to earth in the hills and valleys around Verdun, creating a parallel world which has proved remarkably durable. Here at Camp Elizabeth, they had workshops, kitchens, even a cinema, all served by this light railway. If the shelling grew too heavy, they could withdraw into an underground village, complete with hospitals and dormitories. But General Falkenhayn knew that the war could not be won from the safety of a bunker. Germany's enemies would only grow in strength thanks to their superiority in manpower and material. He believed that Germany should strike first, here at Verdun. Verdun had such symbolic importance to the French that Falkenhayn was sure that they would commit every last man to its defense. Falkenhayn's measure of success would not be in yards of ground gained, but thousands of French lives destroyed. He would use artillery on a scale never seen before to obliterate the French. As Falkenhayn laid his plans, the French officers of Verdun's garrison might have been congratulating themselves on finishing up on one of the quieter sections of the front. The pace of life here was as slow as the flow of the river Meuse. Nothing much had happened at Verdun since the autumn of 1914, and little had been done to prepare its defences. The French commander-in-chief, General Joffre, believed that Verdun wouldn't be attacked because there were better targets for the Germans. But commanders on the ground disagreed. In his frontline command post, about 7 miles from Verdun, Colonel Émile Drion was worried. He thought the front was too thinly held. There were too few bunkers like this, too few men and too few guns. And he thought that it was a likely spot for the Germans to attack. Drion was a talented and well-connected officer who had influential friends. In August 1915, he had used his contacts to persuade the Minister of War to send an inquiry team to Verdun to investigate its defences. Their report confirmed everything Drion had said. When Joffre found that the inquiry had been provoked by Drion, his subordinate, he flew into a rage and rejected its findings. While the French were feuding, the Germans were preparing the most intense artillery bombardment the world had yet seen. By the end of January, aerial photographs and reports from deserters and spies forced Joffre to accept that a huge assault was close. Almost too late, 2 more French divisions were rushed into Verdun. The French had fallen to Falkenhayn's trap. More men for the bloodletting to come. The German soldiers awaited the attack in these concrete bunkers, safe from prying French eyes. On the morning of the attack, they awoke to discover that the weather had turned against them. It was snowing, and the officers directing artillery fire couldn't see through the gloom. The heavy gun batteries remained silent, the millions of stacked shells unused for another 9 days. The 21st of February dawned fine. As the covers were slipped off the barrels of 1,000 German guns, Colonel Drion's men were brewing fresh coffee. Suddenly, the wood was swept by a deluge of shells. Branches were cut off, whole trees uprooted, men buried alive. One of them, Corporal Stefan, wrote, "It was a hurricane, a storm, a tempest growing ever stronger, where it rained nothing but paving stones." Drion had come forward to his command post early that morning. When the first shells fell, he finished giving his orders, then descended these steps into the bunker to receive absolution from his chaplain. The bombardment went on for most of the day. Perhaps 80,000 shells hit the wood. Some reinforced bunkers were simply smashed. And as for the troops in open trenches, they didn't stand a chance. When it stopped, at 4 o'clock that afternoon, the German infantry came on. They expected little opposition, because the guns had done their terrible work. Drion and a few surviving troops fought bravely, but the Germans had brought a new weapon to finish them off. The flamethrower had been developed by the Germans before the war. It had been used against the British with ghastly consequences in 1915. But it was unknown to the French, many of whom were trapped in their bunkers and incinerated alive. Drion's men held this wood until well into the second day of battle. It was only when the Germans had brought up field guns behind him that Drion decided to withdraw. He was killed as he did so. Drion, close to court-martial when the battle began, became one of its first heroes. He followed a military tradition commemorated by these statues of Napoleonic generals in Verdun. To these men, the sword was the symbol of heroic leadership. Even in 1916, some officers still led sword in hand, hoping that sheer dash would carry the day. But the French sword was knocked aside by the power and weight of the German assault. Heroism alone could be no match for the power of the guns, which dominated the few square miles of battlefield.
80 ans après la bataille de Verdun, nous trouvons toujours sur le sol ces cicatrices qui montrent cette violence d'une bataille d'artillerie. Violence parce qu'ici sont tombés plus de 80 millions d'obus. D'obus de tout calibre, du calibre 75 jusqu'au calibre 400 et 420, c'est-à-dire des monstres qui font des entonnoirs de plusieurs mètres de profondeur et de 10 mètres de diamètre.
Et l'effet de l'artillerie sur les hommes, c'était quoi?
C'est l'horreur. C'est l'horreur parce que l'artillerie tombe sur une infanterie qui n'a rien pour se défendre. Les hommes sont dans des tranchées, dans quelques abris, ils creusent comme des bêtes, comme des taups. Une vie en enfer. L'enfer, c'est aussi les destructions causées par cette artillerie, les copains qui sont tués. On reçoit une langue sur la capote, on voit le copain qui reçoit un obus, un éclat d'obus qui le coupe en deux, le copain qui est en train de mourir. On a l'apathie, cette apathie qui met le soldat dans un état second, c'est-à-dire qu'il ne réagit plus.
By February the 25th, just 4 days into the attack, the German tide was lapping against Fort Douaumont, 4 miles from the city. Douaumont was the strongest of Verdun's forts. Its roof is now pockmarked by giant shell holes. In 1916, it was protected by thick belts of barbed wire and machine guns. The fort's main armament, a 155mm gun, lurked under an armoured turret. Underground barracks could hold hundreds of men. Douaumont seemed impregnable. Onto the scene came Pioneer Sergeant Kuntz, who led a section of men under the guns of the fort. He found a gap in the railings, and while he was working out what to do next, a shell burst nearby, and its blast blew him into the ditch. But he got to his feet to see that the only way into the fort seemed to be a firing slit high over his head. He ordered his men to form a human pyramid, scrambled up, and managed to wriggle his way in. The first German soldier had breached Verdun's strongest defense. Kuntz had by now lost contact with his gallant band and found himself wandering alone through this concrete labyrinth. Guided by the thump of the 155mm gun, which was firing at some distant target, he eventually found his way into the turret. The crew was up there, on the firing platform. Kuntz proceeded to take them prisoner and silenced the fort's main weapon. As Kuntz roamed these corridors, pistol in hand, it became clear that there was simply no one about. The fort's garrison had in fact been run down to just 56 elderly artillerymen. An order for reinforcement had been lost in the confusion of battle. Kuntz finally found most of the garrison sheltering in a single room. He locked them in and then sat down to stuff himself with captured food. Soon the rest of his regiment joined him. Douaumont, keystone of Verdun's defences, had fallen without a shot being fired. The fall of Douaumont caused jubilation in Germany. Newspapers even predicted the collapse of France. Some French troops panicked, fleeing before the Germans had even reached their positions. The crisis demanded a change of leadership at Verdun, and Joffre decided to appoint a new commander to check the Germans. General Philippe Pétain was an imposing figure, physically and mentally. He was respected and trusted by his troops. His appointment was a boost to badly battered French morale. Pétain travelled to Verdun against a tide of defeat. Civilian carts laden with belongings, deserters and the walking wounded. He set up his headquarters here, in the Mairie et Thuile, south of the town. His orders were to defend Verdun on both banks of the Meuse. Pétain phoned his commanders, told them that he was in charge and that Verdun would be held. Then he fell asleep here, in a house near the Mairie. When he awoke, he had pneumonia. For the next week, although shaking with fever, Pétain still radiated good common sense. No more crazy counterattacks. Rearm and reinforce the forts. And above all, recognize that it was a gunner's war. The men and guns that Pétain needed to defend Verdun had to come up this road, with a narrow-gauge railway running alongside it. It was the town's only link with the outside world, the artery that pumped blood into Verdun. Day and night, the trucks never stopped. At night it resembled the coils of some gigantic luminous serpent. At its busiest, one truck passed every 14 seconds. It earned the name which still decorates the kilometre stones at the roadside. La Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Way. Petain's adversary, commanding the German Fifth Army, was the Kaiser's eldest son, Crown Prince Wilhelm, unkindly known to British humorists as Little Willie. After the first rush of German success, his troops had been fought to a standstill on the right bank of the Meuse, and the French were bringing up more artillery. Soon they would match him gun for gun and shell for shell. Wilhelm now ordered an attack on the left bank of the Meuse, dominated by two hills. One is called the Mortagne, the Dead Man, perhaps because of some sinister tale from medieval times. In 1916, the term was grimly appropriate. In April and May, the battle seethed across these slopes, stripped bare by artillery and raked by machine gun fire. Even today, the earth up here is still deeply pitted by shells that fell more than 80 years ago. It took the Germans 3 months to capture the Mortagne and its sister Hill 304. By now, Falkenhayn's sword of attrition had become double-edged. He was losing almost as many men as the French.
You eat, you drink beside the dead. You sleep in the middle of the dying. You laugh and sing in the company of corpses.
As artillery became more dominant, the fortunes of the aeroplane soared. New tactics on the ground forced the pace of change in the skies. In 1914, there'd been a handful of primitive planes. By early 1916, new models like this Morane were transforming the role of aviation. Both sides were building up huge fleets in the struggle for air supremacy.
Verdun est en fait la première bataille où on a vu une évolution énorme de transformation de l'aviation. On est passé donc d'une aviation qu'on pourrait appeler passive, c'est-à-dire en réglage d'artillerie, reconnaissance aérienne, et à une aviation de combat pur, avec l'apparition des premiers chasseurs, dont le but était justement d'interdire cette reconnaissance aérienne. Verdun est important parce que c'était une énorme bataille au sol avec une quantité très importante de troupes d'artillerie, et il fallait à tout prix que les adversaires voient ce qui se passait de l'autre côté, et on a vraiment là vu l'arrivée des premiers avions de chasse dont le but était l'interdiction du survol du champ de bataille par les avions d'observation adverses.
Many French pilots were wounded soldiers who could not return to the front. Most were young and could expect to survive no more than a few weeks. Planes were shot down or simply fell from the sky through engine failure. Some pilots quickly became national heroes.
Ils sont devenus des héros parce que la population civile, donc les gens de l'arrière, avaient besoin de s'identifier avec des vainqueurs, et il était plus facile d'avoir un pilote que l'on connaissait, dont on connaissait le nom, dont on connaissait la photo, dont on connaissait le palmarès, et ça permettait aux civils de dire on est les plus forts parce qu'il y a Guilmer, Fonck, etc.
There is only that strip of murdered nature. It seems to belong to another world. Every sign of humanity has been swept away. The woods and roads have vanished like chalk wiped from a blackboard. Of the villages, nothing remains but grey smears.
Pétain believed that his men could only stand so much of this horror, and he rotated his troops through Verdun. Perhaps 2/3 of the army came this way, up to the Calvary of Verdun. But Joffre was growing impatient. He wanted Pétain to attack, and Pétain wouldn't strike till he was ready. In late April, Pétain was promoted and replaced by the fire-eating General Nivelle. In June, the Germans tried again. this time switching their main effort back to Fort Vaux on the right bank of the Meuse. First, they'd tried to shell it into submission, but the thick concrete and earth defences thwarted them. Vaux was much smaller than Douaumont, and its one 75mm turret had already been destroyed. In command was the 49-year-old Major Raynal, an officer so badly wounded that he walked with a stick. When the Germans attacked on the 2nd of June, it took them hours of hard fighting just to take those ditch defences. And when they broke through to the underground galleries beneath them, the French met them man to man and hand to hand. For the next week, Frenchmen and Germans fought their way through this maze. The French would set up a sandbag barricade and defend it with a machine gun. The Germans would destroy it with a demolition charge. The whole fort shook with the blast. Men were deafened by the noise, blinded by the fumes. And so it went on, yard by yard. Above these shattered corridors, on top of the fort, the Germans were in complete control, and from time to time they squirted liquid fire down here. The garrison was tortured by the scorching summer heat, and men licked the condensation from the walls to relieve their thirst. It was thirst that finished Raynal. With no water left, he sent off his last carrier pigeon demanding support. When none came, he was forced to surrender. He'd lost about 100 men. His attackers, almost 3,000. Outside, the shell-torn ground around the forts had become a vast abattoir. The dead lay everywhere, buried and uncovered again by shell blasts.
You found the dead embedded in the walls of the trenches, heads, legs and half bodies, just as they'd been shoveled out of the way by the picks and spades of the working party.
Having despaired of living amid such horror, we begged God not to have us killed, the transition is too atrocious, but just to let us be dead. We had but one desire, the end.
By July 1916, the battle had claimed almost as many German lives as French. Perhaps 500,000 men had been killed or wounded in a tiny strip of land. The shelling never ceased. Those who survived the journey to the front often became lost in a maze of shell holes, and in the dawn became easy targets for the enemy machine gunners. Verdun had by now become more than a battle. It was a symbol of France's struggle against the German invader. Pétain's famous phrase, "Ils ne passeront pas," they shall not pass, echoed throughout the land. Civilians in Paris, just 150 miles away, had little understanding of the terrible realities on the ground. But they did recognize that Verdun had become a matter of national survival.
Et sa signification, c'est celle d'une très grande bataille défensive. Verdun, en 1916, entre le mois de février et le mois de décembre 1916, c'est la bataille de la France. Verdun exprime le sens même du combat français face à l'Allemagne, c'est-à-dire un combat purement défensif, un combat pour le sol, un combat pour protéger les femmes et les enfants, pour protéger les villes de France, et un combat donc à très forte légitimité parce que justement il est défensif. Les soldats n'attaquent pas, ils ne font que se défendre, et contre un adversaire perçu comme attaquant et comme disposant de moyens beaucoup plus importants. Et c'est ce qui donne à la bataille de Verdun son aura romantique, en quelque sorte, de très forte légitimité.
The Germans made their last effort in July. By now their gun barrels were worn through overuse, and their crews were exhausted. But they devised new techniques. They mixed a new kind of gas shell with high explosive, knocking out many of the French batteries. As a result, their infantry pushed right on to Fort Souville, in the last line of defense.
About 30 Germans got right up on top of Fort Souville, and some of them even claimed to have seen the sun glinting off the Meuse down below in Verdun. The fort's garrison had been gassed, and for a moment it seemed as if a battle this big might turn on the action of a handful of men. In the nick of time, about 60 French soldiers arrived and drove the Germans back. It was the high watermark of German success, for they were now under attack themselves, not here at Verdun, but on the Somme. On the 1st of July, the Allies had launched a major attack of their own. Falkenhayn's vision of bleeding France white had faded. The battle had killed or wounded almost as many Germans as Frenchmen. Yet another war-winning attempt at breaking the Western Front had failed.
But the mill on the Meuse did not stop grinding until the autumn. Gradually, the French retook lost ground, including Fort Douaumont. Mighty barrages paved the way. Now the French fought with metal, not flesh.
I've spent my professional life visiting battlefields, but there's something about this one that appalls me more every time I see it. Even now, it's impossible to be certain just what Verdun means in human suffering. Perhaps 1 million men were killed or wounded here. The battlefield was so small, so thoroughly ploughed by shells, that many of the dead could never be identified, or were reduced to mere fragments of humanity. The bones of over 100,000 men lie in the ossuary on Douaumont Ridge. It's the saddest place I know.